All right, why don't we get started? All right, thank you for joining us this evening. This event is titled Rethinking Work in the Age of Distraction. I'm Jason Barabas. I'm the director of the Rockefeller Center for Public Policy and the Social Sciences. I'm also a professor in the Department of Government here at Dartmouth. This is a collaborative effort, and we really appreciate the support with the Montgomery Fellows program. And our speaker tonight is a fellow in that program. Let me quickly just get to introducing the guests, because I'm sure all of you want to ask questions, and we have an exciting program in front of us. So in the course of leading the Rockefeller Center, I interact or invoke the names of Dartmouth alumni quite often. But there's one name that comes up over and over in the Dartmouth Center more generally, and that's Cal Newport. He's a member of the class of 2004. I suspect there are many of us who aspire to implement the suggestions that Cal has. I have a feeling that many of us could really learn some valuable lessons from someone who allocates his time wisely and also writes about how the rest of us can do so. And just today, as a sort of personal self-study, I counted the number of emails I received, and that number was at 58 just about 45 minutes ago, with 32 emails sent on there, more than 12 different Slack conversations. This isn't, I'm not signaling any sort of pride here. 12 Slack messages, and over an hour to fix Slack, which wasn't working, so that was a whole nother set of unanticipated time use problems. So I could go on. I think I'm in need of these messages, perhaps more than most people. So let's just get on with the event then. So, Cal Newport is the Provost Distinguished Associate Professor of Computer Science at Georgetown University, and before arriving at Georgetown, he earned his PhD from MIT. His research focuses on the theory of distributed systems, and at Georgetown, more recently, he's one of the founding members of the new Center for Digital Ethics and the incoming director of the Computer Science Ethics and Society undergraduate major. In addition to his academic work, Cal Newport also writes for audiences at the intersection of technology, work, and the quest to find depth in an increasingly distracted world. He's the author of several books, including Deep Work in 2016, Digital Minimalism in 2019, and A World Without Email in 2021. And that book, that last one, proposes a bold vision for liberating workers from the tyranny of their inboxes. I really liked the way that was put. These are all New York Times bestsellers and been translated into over 40 languages. In fact, I've seen the worldwide impact of his scholarship. So I was at a conference in Athens last year, and one of my fellow panelists spontaneously recommended Cal Newport's books to graduate students and junior scholars, and I wholeheartedly agreed with that recommendation. In addition to his books, Newport is also on the contributing staff for The New Yorker, where he writes about technology, and he's also the host of a popular podcast, Deep Questions with Cal Newport. So we will have an event. We'll have Cal Newport give some remarks, and then we'll open it up for the audience. Our moderator this evening is Professor Jennifer Jerit, one of my fellow colleagues in the Department of Government at Dartmouth College, also a longtime collaborator and admirer of Cal Newport's public-facing scholarship. Dr. Jerit is an expert on public opinion, political communication, and focusing particularly on how people learn and form opinions about the world. Her current research examines, among other topics, attitudes and behaviors in the domain of climate change. She's also the co-editor-in-chief of the Journal of Experimental Political Science and a member of the advisory board of the American National Election Studies. In addition, her research has been funded by the National Science Foundation and the Economic and Social Research Council, and her work has been published in many of the top-tier journals in political science, including the American Political Science Review, the American Journal of Political Science, the Journal of Politics, and Public Opinion Quarterly. So we will have the event. We're going to open this up for both of those of you in the auditorium tonight, but also the at-home audience. You can send your questions to Rocky Q&A. And that will, at dartmouth.edu, that will get your questions to us, and we will pass those along, as well as we will have microphones go around the audience for people who are here who want to ask questions. But first, let's hear a few words from Cal Newport, and then Jennifer Jerit will moderate and then open it up for everybody else. Thank you very much. Join me in welcoming both Cal Newport.
Thank you, Jason, and thank you, Jennifer, for coming to do this. I just want to say a few words before we get into the moderated back and forth. So on the one hand, of course, it's just nice to be back at Dartmouth just because I have a lot of fond memories. This building was new when I was last here. I remember taking the intro computer science course in here. I remember taking the Psych 101 in here. I remember they had an MRI machine and they would give you extra credit if you would do MRI experience. So I spent a lot of time in the MRI machine that they have over here. But it's also, I think, fitting to be back at Dartmouth to talk about what I'm talking about, because my career sort of unfolded in a somewhat unusual direction, because I had this one strand that was focused on computer science, theoretical computer science, theory of distributed systems, sort of a standard computer science career. But I also had this writing side of my career where I was writing books and writing articles. And it really wasn't until more recently at Georgetown as a professor, especially around the time I got tenure, that those two worlds finally started to come together, and my public-facing writing really began to focus more on the impact of technology on different aspects of our lives, which is something that made sense in retrospect for a computer scientist to be writing about. But really it was probably Dartmouth that set me up for that career consilience that happened later, because this is a place, of course, where I studied computer science, but it's also a place where I was getting a liberal arts education. It's also a place where I was an art history minor. It was a place where I was the editor of the Dartmouth Jack-o'-lantern. I'm sort of embarrassed to admit that Keggy the Keg was invented under my watch. That was one of my fellow writers, Nick Duquette, who is now an economics professor and hates that I mentioned that. I wrote for the D as well. I sold and wrote my first book while still here at Dartmouth. And this was the type of place where you could do both of those things, that you could pursue humanistic inquiries and you could mix that with the scientific as well. So that's why I think it's also fitting to be back here for the conversation we're going to have, because it really is a conversation that's at the intersection of what these new tools, these are technological tools, have done to us, but also what we can do to reclaim some semblance of humanity, some semblance of sanity amidst these distractions. So it's good to be back, and it's also fitting to be back.
Great, we're so excited to have you, and there's a lot that you can teach many of us on campus. So I wanted to begin with some questions from your book, Deep Work. And I want to begin with the idea of deep work as a valuable skill. And so I just want to quote a few passages from Deep Work. You write, our work culture shift toward the shallow is exposing a massive economic and personal opportunity for the few who recognize the potential of resisting this change and prioritizing depth. Deep work is not some nostalgic affectation. It's instead a skill that has great value today. And then finally, you quote a business writer who calls deep work the superpower of the 21st century. So my question is, how can Dartmouth cultivate this skill and help its students develop the superpower? I would think a place like Dartmouth has a real interest in teaching its students how to cultivate deep work skills. We have all sorts of other kinds of extracurricular programming related to networking and leadership. And so I wonder whether we should also be teaching students how to focus and concentrate.
Well, I mean, I think it's a great question, and it underlines in some sense, the judo trick I was trying to do with deep work, which was frustration with distraction was rising. And what I realized was the right way to maybe reach an audience was, instead of just pointing that out, flipping that on its head and saying, well, wait a second. If we're falling into this world of distraction somewhat accidentally against our better interest, it's making us less productive, it's making organizations run more poorly, it's making people miserable. If you're one of the few people to actually think about and care about it, you will have, relatively speaking, this big advantage. So this was my entryway into trying to elucidate this issue in a way that was going to hopefully gather more attention. And the first step here, I mean, the first step of that book, and I think the first step of this conversation was just names. Just naming the activity of undistracted work as a separate activity from other things we do in work. At the time, work was work. Everything was merged together, and I think as a culture, especially knowledge work, we operated on a metric I call pseudo-productivity, which is essentially just more is better than less, busyness is better than non-busyness. If you're doing something visibly, then at least I know you're not slacking off, and then that's basically the best we can do. So to actually go in there and name these activities. There's undistracted work, which for the core things we do to produce value in a lot of jobs, we'll call it deep work. And then there's everything else that supports it. And these are two separate things. And the undistracted work needs protection and practice and training, and we should actually care about it. Just naming it, I was hoping, was going to be an important first step. What colleges can do, I've thought a lot about this. I think colleges could be the place where we model the possibility of the life of the mind, where we model what is possible when you actually, in some sense, cultivate or respect mental life, that you try to train your brain to be able to think clearly and produce real thought out of it. I mean, that is the core activity of our liberal arts education. So a few years ago, I wrote an article about this for the Chronicle of Higher Education, where I was proposing, I said, colleges should be citadels of concentration, the place where we pass this message. And the editors put the title on it, is Email Making Professors Stupid. And the dean called me in to have lunch with him after that, which was interesting. And I thought I was in trouble, but then he admitted that he spent too much time sending emails. And so I think there is something there. Now, how we actually do it, I think part of it is modeling. I think it's the way even just faculty talk about life of the mind and model what that could be like. And I also think there's great value in just again, this explicit naming of concentration is a rarefied activity. It's a valuable activity for the history of humanity. It's one that, especially if you have the privilege or honor of being at a sort of an elite institution like this, that you should not take for advantage. You should respect that when you study, you should just be studying without the instant messenger open, without the phone. When you're in class, you should be there trying to actually take in the information, that you should become comfortable reading a book for a while without switching attention away, and that's something that takes training. So I think naming what this is, noting this activity has value, modeling that this is something that we take seriously at universities, and just talking about it. I think all those things are important.
In my, I introduced this idea in my freshman writing seminar because I think students will write better if they're working deeply and not distracted by the internet and devices. And it's very hard for them to devote even 1 hour in the week. That's kind of our challenge, to unplug for a week and just write.
Yeah.
And the ones who do are like, wow, this was great. But many people just can't.
Yeah.
Like you have to build, it's like a muscle you have to train.
Well, I have an actual, so there's a regimen I developed years ago. So right after I left Dartmouth, I published my first book on student advice and wrote the other one right after it. So as a first and second year grad student, because I had these books out on student advice, and I had a blog, I started a blog called Study Hacks, essentially just to support the books. It was, okay, here's the information that I didn't get around to putting in the books. And so I began mentoring students from the Boston area. So students at MIT, but also at Harvard and BU and BC. Because my idea was, look, I'll bring this advice to them, they'll do better, I'll write about it, be good for the book. And I came across this exact issue. Was, for me, I would say, yeah, so obviously just work for a few hours here without distraction. Just focus on this, it'll get done much faster. I used to go to Dana Biomedical Library, used to be my secret spot, among the stacks where the lights turn off when the motion sensor stops. And they struggled with this. So I began essentially developing, it was like a nerd version of Rocky IV. I began developing these sort of ad hoc training regimes for these students. And the one we worked on that worked really well was interval training. And we would start with 30 minutes, and the goal was just work on this assignment with no distractions for 30 minutes. If you look at a computer or your phone, you have to start over. Because that was pretty short, they would more or less do it. That's so short, the time's coming up, you don't want to, it'd be embarrassing for yourself to say, couldn't just make it 30 minutes. We would start at 30 minutes, and the rule was, when you've been comfortable for 2 weeks, at a given duration, you add 10 minutes. That's the way we incremented it up. And that actually worked out pretty well, that if you started at the beginning of a semester, maybe a quarter's not long enough, but if you started at the beginning of a semester, they could be up to 90 minutes pretty comfortable by the end. So doing that training along the way, by the end of a semester, then they could lock in for about 90 minutes with pretty intense concentration. And once you can do that, that's a very valuable skill. You often don't even have longer than 90 minutes at a time anyways. But the key lesson I took out of that was, you have to train this as hard as anything else. I didn't realize the degree to which I was implicitly training this skill as an undergrad, because again, I was right at that transition point. I arrived at Dartmouth without a laptop or a cell phone. So I was at a point where you would implicitly get this training, because if you went to a library to study, you had nothing else you could do. You had to go down 3 flights of stairs in Dana and wait for one of the public computers, the check blitz, and it was a pain. And so we were implicitly, I didn't realize the extent to which my generation was explicitly training the focus. And I learned pretty quickly that even for people who were slightly younger, let's just make it specific. Just like you would train to run a 5K or just like you would train to learn a foreign language. It's something you can practice.
Mm-hmm. Well, somewhat in tension with this idea, institutions of higher education have many ways of operating that don't allow their faculty to concentrate, engage in deep work. And I was explicitly thinking of your piece in Chronicle of Higher Education, Is Email Making Professors Stupid? So, I mean, so much of the weekly and even daily routine of a college campus interferes with a scholar's ability to think. So how do we change the standard way of operating at places like Dartmouth and other institutions of higher education, where there are just certain ways of doing things that make deep work hard? So, you know, are there workshops we can have, you know, teaching people how to use Trello or how to write emails effectively to reduce back and forth? Just concretely, how do we kind of change the norm? We can't expect our students to think deeply if we're not able to do it either.
Right, and it is complicated. I've given these workshops at Georgetown before, so I know it's complicated. Let me briefly get what I think the core issue is. So this is really at the core of the book, A World Without Email. So my analysis of what happened here is, if you go back and study the spread of email in the business sector, this happened largely in the 1990s, really the mid-1990s to the early 2000s is where you see the ubiquitous spread of inter-office networking and email clients. If you go back and read the press coverage surrounding email in the 80s or 90s, what you see is it was introduced very pragmatically. It was solving a practical problem, which is fax machines and voicemails and using messengers to send packages across town was a pain, and it was annoying, and email did all that much easier. So there's this very easy selling proposition. You have these equipment, you have voicemail systems that cost you this much, you have fax, and email can do this all better. This was one of the core propositions. So it spread very fast, and it solved that problem very well. But it also had this unintended consequence, which is something I highlight again and again in my recent writing about. We have these collisions of technology and commerce, or technology and culture, and it's often the unintended consequences that then create the biggest impacts. And here what seemed to happen is, once we had low friction digital communication, it almost overnight, as it arrived in different institutions, changed the rhythm and style of collaboration. And in fact, I have a case study I uncovered at IBM, late 1980s. They're installing an internal email system they're building from scratch because it was IBM. And I found one of the engineers that was involved in this project. And what they had done was a survey of all of their employees to figure out how much communication are you doing on an average day? How many memos are you writing? How many phone calls are you making? They wanted to find out all the communication that was happening, because their idea was, we'll provision a mainframe that can handle that much communication. Because the 80s and mainframes were expensive. And so they did this survey, they figured it out, they provisioned a computer, and maybe it was a mini computer, but whatever, it was expensive. And they provisioned it so it could handle even all the communication that was happening. If it all moved to email, it would still be okay. And it took 3 days for that server to melt down. Because the presence, just the mere presence of the tool, increased the amount of communication by a factor of 5, and it did it in something like 48 hours. Way faster than you could have, you know, memos coming down from up top that said, here's the way we're going to communicate now, before you could have these sort of intentional types of culture shifts that we might study in a sort of like social construction of technology type of framework. It just happened overnight in an emergent fashion. Because when you remove the friction, then it became easier just to go back and forth. And so what happened in the knowledge sector in general, not just academia, is we fell into a collaboration style that I call the hyperactive hive mind of communication is so cheap, let's just figure things out on the fly with back and forth messaging. We can just start conversation. Hey, what about this? What's happening with this client? I forgot what time this is happening. It took the natural way that humans collaborate in small groups in person, and it allowed us to scale that up to large groups, to scale it up over space, to scale it up over whole organizations or sectors. So once that happened, we, in some sense, got stuck in a suboptimal Nash equilibrium. No one person could leave it. Because once this is the way we were collaborating, everything's just back and forth on the fly, it was hard to unilaterally leave that system, because if this is how decisions are made and you're not there, participating back and forth in the stream, you're causing a problem. And so we sort of got stuck in this way of back and forth organizing. And this is what's causing a lot of the problems we're seeing with burnout, a lot of the problems we're seeing with exhaustion and productivity and knowledge work, because if we have to be involved in 12 ongoing conversations, many of which are timely, so I have to see when the next message comes in because I have to bounce that back in time for you to bounce it back, in time for me to bounce it back so we can reach a decision before 5, I have to check these inboxes all the time. Not because it's a bad habit, not because there's a general norm around response time that's not proper, but because the fundamental mode of collaboration in the organization depends on this type of back and forth communication. And every time I have to check this inbox, it induces a cognitive context switch. And my brain starts switching from what I'm doing to the context of the inbox, which is highly salient. It involves people I know. Often there's urgency in there. It's a very alarming context. The brain, all hands on deck, switches over to this context. But then I wrench my attention back to the thing I'm writing. And now it tries to stop that context and return to the context of political opinion and climate change. But before I can really get back to this context, I have to check the inbox again because I'm waiting for a message. And then your mind gets all muddled and we get exhausted. And by 2, we can't work anymore. All of this was essentially accidental and emergent, but the issue is then, and this was the premise of my most recent book, is we can't solve it with just individual habits, because again, I can't opt out of this on my own if this is how decisions are being made. Now I'm going to be a problem. We can't opt out of it with general norms. So that was, when I first began talking about this, anyone from the C-suite would always use that word. They would say, we just need to fix the norms. They figured if we just sent a memo and said, don't expect a response in 24 hours, we'd be okay. But we need a response much quicker because, again, this is a 7-message back and forth conversation to reach a decision that we need to make by 5 because we have to get back to someone, so that didn't work either. The only real solution is to actually put in place alternatives to the hyperactive hive mind. It actually requires saying, for this type of work, this is how we collaborate. It's not just send messages back and forth, it's whatever. The information is stored here, and this is when and how we talk about it, and here's the processes we use for the recurring things. And it's bespoke, and it's customized, and it's really hard. And this has been basically the conclusion I've come away from with this work, is the reason why we haven't seen wholesale transformation away from this highly distracting environment. And it really is. The best data I've found shows the average knowledge worker will check an inbox once every 6 minutes. And that's basically constantly. The reason why, even though that's terrible for productivity, you're getting a bunch of human minds and asking them to produce value through cognition, and then you put them into a constant state of context shifts, is a terrible idea for productivity. It's like turning off the lights in the car factory to save money on the electrical bill. And now we're putting steering wheels where the tire is supposed to go and nothing's really working. But the reason why we don't see wholesale change is that it's so difficult. It's so difficult to fix because you have to rebuild collaboration systems from the ground up. You have to have buy-in from everyone involved. It's hard to get these things right. And it's not that I've turned towards pessimism, but I've been humbled in this quest by working and talking to companies and people who are working on this. It's a really difficult problem. Knowledge work punted on the question of how do we want to organize our efforts. We punted it to the individual. We said productivity is personal. And when email came along, that led us to a very, very difficult place where now we're stuck checking an inbox once every 6 minutes with no real obvious way to actually fix that.
So what do you talk about in your workshops at Georgetown? Are there some concrete ways to improve the status quo, or?
So yeah, so the 2 things I often say now is, one, just the basic principle of understanding that it's context shifts are the productivity poison. So just organizing everyone around the same principle that when you switch your attention from one thing to another, you should be very wary about that. It really causes, from a productivity standpoint, it causes a huge amount of problems. And you got to start thinking about every time I have to leave the thing I'm writing and look at an inbox, this is really bad for the thing I'm writing. So then once you identify the context shifts as the productivity poison, then you start thinking creatively, so how do we minimize that? And then that leads to discussions of processes and alternatives. And some of the things that fall out of these discussions, taking the office hour paradigm from academia and using it for non-academic interactions. Actually, this works very well. There's companies who now do this. You say, here are my office hours. Anything that requires more than a 1 message response. Email's great for that. can you remind me what time something is? That's fine, I can send you that information. But anything that requires back and forth, just come to my next time office hours, my phone's on, Slack is on, my door is open. We'll just defer it till then. Just stop by, we'll figure it out in 5 minutes. So now you're consolidating maybe 10 different back and forth conversations that might have cumulatively created 50 to 100 emails, each of which themselves might have created 5 different inbox checks while you waited for it. All that's now happening in one concentrated hour, so the footprint's much smaller. Teams are doing this too. There's a strategy called docket clearing meetings where teams that work on the same thing will have a shared document and people add to it stuff that needs to be discussed. And then they have these twice weekly docket clearing meetings where they just go through these one by one. When everyone is there, you can actually start getting through these things pretty quickly. All right, so what are we gonna do about that? You're gonna take care of that. What's happening with this? And then you wait till the 2 days later to talk about what's new. That makes a really big difference. Processes for regular work that happens all the time. This is another thing that emerges from these conversations. If there's a report that's produced every month, you can come up with a process that everyone agrees on of when and where information goes. This goes to this Dropbox by this point. This person has it until Wednesday at noon. They'll add their comments. At that point, you can take it till Thursday at noon. We have a standing 30-minute meeting then to reconcile our comments. The designer knows to pick it up Friday morning and put the finished PDF. You can start to work out these processes, which might seem like this is extra overhead, but if they're minimizing context shifts, then actually it ends up being a big win. Following rules, waiting to have to do things, deferring interactions, the cost of those are almost always diminutive compared to the cost of having to constantly, again, shift your context back and forth. So once people know what it is they're trying to minimize, these type of solutions emerge, but they emerge in ways that are often bespoke to what type of work they do, what this team actually handles, what actually fits the rhythm. So I'm a big believer in, once you know the principle of what you do, you can activate creativity for figuring out, okay, how do we work in this world?
Mm-hmm. So you're busier now than ever, especially when you first started writing these books. So how have your strategies adapted? How do you preserve your deep work time? Has that shifted? Maybe it hasn't.
Oh, it for sure shifts. I mean, I have a collection of heuristics and strategies I use, and they have shifted over time. Seasonality is a big one. I think a lot of professors lean into this. There's busier semesters where you're doing a lot of academic work or service work, and then there maybe is summertime or another semester when you're not, and so more writing will happen in an off semester than in a busy semester. I'm a big believer in fixed schedule productivity, so you fix your schedule in advance. These are the hours I work, and then you work backwards to say, what do I have to do to actually honor that? And then that leads to a lot of innovation, but it also leads to a lot of schedule pruning, right? So if you fix, I don't work past this time, and you're not able to do it, then it's a signal I need to be doing less. You get back pressure. As a professor, there's specific things that help. Quotas help, program committee quotas, review quotas, stuff that's regular for professors saying, for this year, for this semester, this is the number of these that I think is appropriate to do. And then when the quota fills, you're able to communicate with clarity, I'm happy to help with this. I really appreciate this journal. I do have this sort of quota on reviews, and I hit it recently, so I'm not gonna be able to do it this time. And that's actually it's a respectful thing to say, and it's also a hard thing to argue against, because the main argument is just your quota's wrong, it should be bigger or something, which like an editor is not typically gonna argue. I've also had to innovate processes, certainly around being an author, right? And even little things, like how do I deal, this didn't matter when I was publishing small books, but now like publicity tours are an issue. So like I figured out the hard way, don't let a publicist have control of your calendar. So I've tried that before, because if a publicist has control of their calendar, they think they're playing a video game where you get more points for the more things you fit. So if you can fit everything in, it's like you get the high score and all the things. Meanwhile, my life is unlivable. So I learned at some point, okay, we need to have a system where we put the opportunities in a shared document, and every day I go in there and I can be in the loop of saying, let's not do this one, let's do this one on this day. So I actually have some control over time, so I can clear out this morning, but then maybe pack this other afternoon. So I've learned that lesson the hard way. And then the final thing, and this is the book I'm working on now, so I just handed in the manuscript, is becoming more of an adherent of what I call slow productivity, which is just do all these things over a longer period of time. That if you look back over 10 years, you might say, wow, this is cool, you did this and that and this. But if you did each of those one after another, those 10 years weren't necessarily very stressful. And so that's, especially with kids now, I just slow everything down. I'll just take more time to write this book, or I'll maybe publish less papers this year. Just slow everything down. I'm working on this now. When I'm done, then I'll work on that. And it stretches things out. But one of the things I learned is no one really keeps track of how long things took you. They tend to just aggregate everything you did. And they tend to imagine you did all of those things yesterday. And so it can seem as if, wow, you must be really busy. But slow productivity has been a savior. I mean, my example is people don't know Isaac Newton spent decades to finish the Principia. They just know he wrote this book that changed all of science and our understanding of the world. They don't care or know how long it took him to write it. And so that's been sort of freeing for me recently as well, is just work slow and steady, one thing at a time, switch from one thing to another and back again. This used to not be my modus operandi. It's all relative to the length of your adult life so far. So as a young grad student, I just felt like I had no time. I had to do everything. And my advisor used to tell me, this is crazy. Just work on this paper until you're done, and then work on the next paper. And I'm like, no, I got to write this book and 2 papers of this, because I felt, at that age, I felt like I have no time. I got to get rolling. I remember being very impatient at Dartmouth, for example. I need to get going and doing things. That's why I sold my first book while I was still here. It's like, I got to do things. And as you get tireder with age, then the slow productivity approach has its advantages.
Mm-hmm. Good tips. So I'm sure people in the audience have lots of questions. So let's shift to hear what you all have to say. And I'd like to remind the audience online that you can email your question to rockyqa@dartmouth.edu. And so we've got microphones here. So I see a hand. We'll just wait a moment to get the microphone to you.
Okay, there's the microphone.
Okay, there, and then we'll grab you in the front too. Mm-hmm. Go ahead.
Hi, we good audio? Thank you for coming. I liked what you had mentioned really way at the beginning about building confidence, because I think it's really easy to develop a set of rituals and then go, you don't follow it one day and it falls off and you're like, I'll never be able to set a schedule. And I think that building up 10 minutes at a time is really effective. I'm curious what the sort of analog for that on like a Scrum team would be, where you have, you're like, we're going to set up office hours, going to have a meeting every week. It doesn't work, and someone's like, that's too much ritual, that's too much structure. How you build that confidence for a team.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. I think Scrum and Agile methodologies in general are interesting for multiple reasons. I mean, one reason is it's very relevant, I think, as a quick aside for the discussion on remote work. I did a lot of writing about remote work during the pandemic for the New Yorker, and one of the things that I talked about was the knowledge industry sector. There's the knowledge economy sector that even pre-pandemic had a lot of success with remote work was actually software development. There's many software development firms that were largely remote pre-pandemic. Part of what made that happen is Scrum or Agile methodologies in general added more structure to how work is organized, added more structure to how do we figure out who's working on what, how do we communicate about work, we have the daily Scrum. And so there's a lesson to extract from there of introducing more structure to how work is organized and assigned and talked about actually makes things like remote work more possible, because now we know what's happening. The flip side, as you're also probably pointing out, is the problem with Scrum is people like me, like computer people like me, we like details, and Scrum can sometimes go a little bit off the rails in terms of the obsessive level of detail where, I'm a level 4 Scrum Master that, rolls a D20 to figure out if I take a sprint on an alternate Wednesday or whatever. So that's the flip side of it is it can get so detailed that also turns people off. So actually the people that seem to be having a lot of success are non-engineer types that are taking basic ideas from Scrum but don't really care about getting lost in a lot of detail. So they're in this happy sweet spot of let's have something like a daily stand-up and like a Kanban style board to keep track of who's working on what. but that's kind of enough and we'll figure out the rest along. We can improvise from there. That seems to be the sweet spot with this. It's more structured than just here's your Slack handle, here's your email, rock and roll. But maybe it's less structured than sort of off the rails agile, where it's, we get obsessed about the rules just for having the rules. And so I don't know if that's maybe the issue you're picking up, is that when things get too obsessively detailed, then everything falls apart because people get tired of it. So I think it's a good thing you're pointing out, and that balance is hard. It is hard, and it's why I advise when people are building these systems from scratch, have buy-in from everyone and keep checking in on this thing. Is this working? Is this starting to, what's not working? What can we prune off again? We added this thing that we never do anymore, but we still show up at this meeting and no one's there. That sort of constant sanity checking and pruning, that sort of injection of common sense, I think is really important.
Thank you. There was a question down here.
Okay. Thanks, Professor Newport. I've been a fan of yours for a long time. I read your book about being a college student before I showed up here. And the third piece of advice in the book was, I think, to not do all your reading, which I'm going to submit now that Professor Newport's my professor. That's the reason I'm here instead of doing the reading we're supposed to have.
You only had one thing to read, though, so.
That's tough to come back from. No, I'll definitely finish that for class tomorrow. But, my question is, I'm a new graduate student, and, after reading the book about being a college student, which I loved, I read Digital Minimalism. And I tried the digital declutter, and I really liked it. I used my phone much less. I don't use social media as much. But the thing that didn't quite work as expected and as digital minimalism sort of the thing that I felt was missing, even though it was very helpful, was it's not necessarily socially accepted for people our age, the age of the undergraduate and new graduate students, to be a digital minimalist. My girlfriend's friends say it's a red flag that I don't use my phone. My friends are upset if I'm doing deep work or whatever, I have my phone off. It's expected that you can be contacted. And so how do you think, not whose job is it, but how can we get to a point where being a digital minimalist or not having social media, that's something, or how can you communicate to people that that's something that's socially acceptable?
Yeah, it's a very good question. And let me say first as an aside, impressed by your dealing with the word minimalism and minimalist. This was a writer's term. This was a writer's issue. In my mind as a writer, I was like, what a great term, until I got to the publicity tour for that book and realized it's really hard to say minimalist and minimalism all the time. So you can tell that's a term that was invented by a writer and not a speaker. So this is a very common issue that you're talking about, and I think there's two relevant points. One, minimalism is different than minimization. So there's similar roots, but there is a point to using that different terminology. So at the key of minimalism is figuring out what matters to you. And then once you know that, figuring out what's the best way to use technology to support the things I care about. And then being confident not using the other things, right? So presumably contact with your friends, contact with your girlfriend, contact with your family. These people are important to you and contact's important to you, right? So you wouldn't want to say, I don't want to do this anymore. So then you get to where I think you are right now. It's like, okay, so what's the right way to use technology to support this thing I care about? Like my phone, I can now talk to someone who's in a different city and more easily, and this is all great. How do I do that in a way that makes the most sense, that maybe doesn't have the worst negative externalities on my ability to focus? And that's sort of where you are now. Having some sort of specificity around it tends to make a difference. So you can tell the people in your life, this is typically how I work with WhatsApp or text messages. When I'm working, because I'm a grad student, like when I'm reading, like for Professor Newport's class, like of course I want no distraction, and so like I don't have my phone when I'm reading because it distracts me. But I do have it turned on for phone calls, so if there's an emergency, I can be reached. So of course there's no actual like logistical issue there. But then I do have it on when I'm doing other things, and it's just very specific and very detailed in that sense, and people tend to come around. It takes them a month or so. Like, okay, yeah, when he's reading, we can't get him on text, so we can call if there's an emergency. he's been hanging around that like Newport guy too long. Like, okay, it's like less a red flag than just sort of like he's a little eccentric or something like that. So I think specificity helps. Like, this is important to me. I want to be contactable by you. Yeah, there are some things I do when I'm not contactable. And if you think about it, that's not that weird. I mean, if you were into orienteering or something, they'd be used to that. Like when I'm out in the White Mountains, my phone doesn't work. You know, they wouldn't say, don't orienteer because I want to be able to text you. It's like, oh, okay, that kind of makes sense to me. So I think the specificity does help. But I will say, so yeah, this is an issue. The issue that's not as big anymore that used to be, and I think this is progress, is it also used to be an issue not to be heavily engaged on social media. So when that book I was first working on the book, that was also an issue. That's no longer an issue, right? So I think it's very comfortable, you know, if you say I don't use Facebook or Twitter or TikTok, people don't care. They're not impressed, but they're also not surprised. They just don't care. It didn't used to be that way. So there's some hope when it comes to rhythms of digital communication. We might be getting to a point where that's a lot more common. There's just a greater diversity in people's habits there. So it will get easier, I would predict, as the years go on. But just be really specific, and then just blame it on me.
There's a question right down here.
And we have one
with the
over
blue
there
shirt?
too.
Oh,
We have a
okay.
mic over there as well.
Oh, okay. All right. Yeah, maybe we haven't got to this side. How about let's over here?
Hi, first off, thank you for your time. So I'm curious, like, why do you think we, live in a culture where people don't value deep work per se? Like, I would say people value more efficiency. Like, is there a problem with the cultural values, and like, why is that? And then on more of like an individual basis, like, let's say I'm having an issue with focusing. Why is it that so many people struggle just to address the personal problems in their life? Like, obviously you figured out creative solutions to, become more focused. Why is it that so many people just struggle and it becomes a chronic problem? And so I guess that touches on like personal agency, personal responsibility. Like, what do you believe in that kind of stuff? And yeah.
Yeah, well done. Two good questions. So the issue with why do we value things other than focus, part of it is I don't think we had a reason in past times. We didn't really have a reason to need to explicitly identify that activity as something specifically we could be good at or bad at, or that we should practice. It was just implicitly something that you would learn, let's say going to college. You go to college, pre-cell phone, pre-computer, pre-internet. You're going to spend a lot of time focusing. That's how you would read books. That's what would happen in class. And so back then to say like you should practice or protect focusing, it would be like telling someone to practice walking. So I walk all the time. Like I know how to walk. I get a lot of practice with walking. It's not a big deal. It really was, I think, digital communication tools and then the rise of platform attention monopoly. So the attention economy plus digital communication tools that necessitated, really for maybe the first time in human history, the need to actually treat focus as a standalone activity that we might have to preserve. Almost like you wouldn't think a lot about healthy eating 100,000 years ago. It was like, these are the foods that are available. We typically don't have enough. This is just not an issue that is relevant until you really get to a place where technology has invented plentiful, cheap industrial food, for example. And I think that's really what happened with focus is we didn't have to isolate it before. Digital technology made it possible for us to impoverish that part of the human experience artificially. And that's what necessitated more recently us having to say, wait a second, this is actually a thing that is important. We took it for granted how much this was a part of just the normal sort of life cycle of training and going to college and entering the knowledge sector. We're losing that. I don't think we intend to lose it. There's a lot of consequences to losing this. We now have to be more careful about protecting it. And then, so then for your second question, let me just make sure I understand it properly. So what are you, maybe reword, or can you ask again the second question? I want to make sure I understand it correctly.
Like, let's say focus is, it's a widespread problem.
Yeah.
And it's a chronic problem. Why is it that, any individual in their normal life, like, they encounter this problem, why is it that they struggle to
Right.
get over that?
So why, even after we recognize, focus is important, it'd be important for my job, it'd be important for things I'm doing in my life outside of work, why do we still struggle with it?
Right.
Yeah, no, so there's two different reasons, and I think it's important here to separate what's happening with digital communication tools and what's happening with, we haven't talked much about it yet tonight, but attention economy tools like social media. Because they both have the same effect, which is we're looking at our phones too much, we're looking at our screens too much, we're context shifting too much. But there's two different causes for this effect, and it's important to pull those apart. So when we look at, let's say, attention economy tools like TikTok or online information, there the problem is just quite specifically that they're engineered for us to pay attention to them. And that's really hard to resist, especially if you're not prepared for the whole array of attention engineering that goes into making, for example, TikTok so irresistible to look at once you start looking at it. So with those type of tools, we're fighting against engineered distraction. And the solutions there are difficult. It involves digital minimalism typically. It involves having to try to overhaul your relationship with technology. There's really are, it's not nearly as severe, but there certainly are, when I've worked on this issue, psychological overlaps with the sort of substance addiction community. There's some similar factors at play at a much more attenuated level, but similar types of factors are at play. And then when it comes to digital communications, I'm looking at email too much, for example, I'm looking at text messages too much. This is more about just the structure of how work unfolds. This is what we were talking about earlier with this, I'm checking email all the time. It's not a willpower issue, it's because these ongoing conversations are how decisions are being made. And I need to be involved in that to do my job, and it's not easy for me to step out of that. So I think we have two different things going on. We have more agency about the personal distraction. It's a very hard problem, but at least we have agency. There's no boss who will get mad at us if we stop using TikTok. The email Slack issue is more fundamental because it's built into the systemic fabric of how collaboration happens in the workplace. So it's like two different foes that bring us to a similar place, and they all feed each other and sort of build the culture of distraction that we're only now starting to emerge from.
There were two other questions here, and I won't forget you.
Thanks. Hi. So my question, I understand and I really synthesize how all the methods that you write about and that you explain today can work when you're managing a team or you're creating an environment in a workplace. But for young professionals that go right out of Dartmouth into these very heavy corporate jobs, how do you gain back a lot of your personal autonomy when you're in these positions without giving up that professional zeal? I have a lot of friends who are doing quant, or they're consulting or things like that, very typical jobs straight out of Dartmouth and Dartmouth schools, who feel that they are very stretched thin, although they have no other avenue but to overperform and answer everything from their higher ups, because that is the environment, and if they don't do it, then that means no callback offer, or it means a shot in their foot for their professionalism in the future.
Yeah, no, it's a good question. Partially, some of these jobs are just culturally very demanding in this way. Probably the worst is law. I think big law is it's kind of an issue. There's definitely a culture there of you're constantly billably communicating with people. And I've given some talks at law firms and have talked to some young associates that are, I'll just say, not buoyant with happiness, I would say, would be the way I'd summarize it. That being said, in consulting and quant work, to some degree in investment banking, there is some wiggle room. Where the wiggle room comes from is, in some sense, being very, very organized, very reliable. When you say you're going to do something, it gets done when you said you're going to do it. And if that has to change, then you make it clear, hey, I said this would be Tuesday mornings, I should be Tuesday afternoon, and then you deliver then. There is a trust that's gained, right? So part of when it comes to accessibility, the need for accessibility rises as your degree of reliability falls, especially with someone who's new. If you're a young associate, the degree to which I'm not sure that you're going to get this done or you're going to do it right, then you better answer me right away, because I essentially have to be on you to make sure that this thing gets done. And I don't want to have to keep track of this. So as soon as I think of something, I want to send you a note about it. And I don't have the systems to keep track of this. I would rather you just answer me right away so I don't have to worry about it. But you can often trade accountability to reduce accessibility. It's, okay, he gets the things done he says he can be done. He's very organized. He has his things moved around and these systems that he uses, and So maybe, right, he's not answering an email right away, but he's showing his worth in that things get done, they get done at a high level, he seems really organized, and you can essentially trade in some of that reliability for less accessibility. As you move up, you get more of this trade-off possible. There's a professor friend of mine who also writes a lot of books, Adam Grant at Wharton, and he had this term, idiosyncrasy credits. As you do your thing better, it's like you get these idiosyncrasy credits that you can trade in for, this is kind of a weird thing about me, but I don't do email all the time, or I'm bad at Slack, or I'm not like really quick to respond, but I'm really great at the decks I put together, my analyses are top notch, and so you get away with it. But if you're not doing well, then, so my answer to a lot of these questions is often I wrote a book about this, but I did write a book about this in 2012, and the terminology I used was career capital, but the book was called So Good They Can't Ignore You, but there's a whole framework about building career capital through mastering skills that were unambiguously valuable to your market niche, and then trading in that capital to gain control over the shape of your career and job. And it sort of lays out a whole framework for how to do this, to how to essentially negotiate your way up to the job, to function the way you want to function it by building these skills and then cashing it in. So that might be one worth checking out for sure.
Mm-hmm. There was a person right down here in the blue shirt.
I work in healthcare, and I have this fantasy that the organization would just set a quota on the number of emails that could come in or go out in 24 hours, so when it reaches, say, 25, people get a message that says, sorry, Dr. Kirkland's received as many emails as she can today. Please call her or stop by her office. Would that work? And if not, why? And have you considered, it seems like this could really help the economics of healthcare to control email, and I'm wondering if you have written a book about it or have ideas.
The issue in healthcare is a real one. As a computer scientist, I get a surprising number of invitations to do grand rounds because this is a systemic issue, through a lot of healthcare. To me, the issue is the key to reducing this type of communication overload is almost always to figure out what purpose is serving and then to put in place an alternative. So the issue with just send less email, check email less often, is the problem is it's usually serving a purpose. Now with healthcare, the issue is they created this purpose. I mean, the real nail in the coffin, especially for clinical providers, seemed to be the addition of this instant messenger capability to sort of Epic EMRs. Like once they added this, it just exponentially increased the amount of back and forth communication that was happening with healthcare providers, which is from a pure cognitive productivity perspective, it's nonsense, right? Healthcare providers have to constantly switch context when they're supposed to be bringing in complex information and making cases. It doesn't make sense, right? I mean, again, it's like turning off the lights at the car factory to save money on the electric bill. That's convenient for the accountant in charge of the electric bill, but it makes people worse at building cars. But here the solutions are almost always, okay, so who is trying to reach you? We need an alternative for whatever it is they're trying to do. And the right way to measure the alternative is minimizing context shifts. And I think where we ended up with just increasing the amount of back and forth is we tend to try to minimize, when we think about productivity, we borrow the idea from industrial productivity and say we want to minimize time, we want to minimize friction, we want to say what's the easiest way for this isolated task to get done? Well, I could just hit a button and it'll just jump over to your thing and you could just answer me back, and in isolation that's so efficient. But when it comes to cognitive work, efficiency and time and friction aren't the things you want to try to optimize. What you want to optimize is how few times do I have to switch my attention from one thing to another? How few times do I have to be interrupted when I'm working on something that's important? We don't have that mindset. IT doesn't have that mindset. The productivity software industry does not have that mindset. They see humans like computer processors that just agnostically execute instructions, and the key is just to make sure that the pipeline is full so you never miss an opportunity to do something. They don't understand how the human brain works. So maybe it would work indirectly to do what you're talking about because it would force an alternative solution. But you would have to, this is often the key to all these issues. what is our alternative system for how this collaboration happens that doesn't require an unscheduled message to arrive that I then have to see and reply to?
I think there was a student question back there. Yeah.
Thank you, Professor Newport. I'm a new grad student, and I've been exposed to your work for about 2 years now, and I would definitely consider myself a slow productivity type of guy, probably because of my introduction to Eastern philosophy and the Tao and all those things. I've come to a crux, though, in my own development because I implemented just tons of reflective practices 2 years ago, and now there's a higher demand on my output that has kind of bled into my reflective practice time. These reflective practices include meditation, journaling, different things that help me know what to do. And I just want to know, like, do you have any tips on how I could balance both of those worlds? Because I find that the reflective practices matter more to me, but as far as my job, the institutions, they want something else from me.
Yeah.
And I know that because of, my second question would be also the importance of philosophy in helping you figure out what is the right thing to do. Because for me now I know it's the means that matter more than the ends, and this is what led me to probably sitting right here in this lecture hall.
Yeah.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's a very good question. So I think part of things to keep in mind here is refactoring your practices, refactoring your strategies or the systems you use. Doing that on a regular basis is both necessary and a good thing, right? Because your professional situation changes, your family situation changes, your health situation changes. What you'll find is every 2 or 3 years, the situation is different enough that it probably would benefit from you stepping back and saying, okay, let's blank slate, what's important to me, what are my obligations, what's a good way to make this fit? So sometimes the issue comes is a setup of practices in terms of how they're scheduled or when you do them work perfectly well in 2021, but then in the 2023 reality, they don't work, but there's a way to take the same underlying needs there, the same things that are important to you, and come with a different configuration that is much more tractable with, let's say, the reality of your current job. So I think that's part of it. Another part of it, because I go through this all the time. Every time I have a life event, have another kid, add another thing in my job, decide to do something else, I always have to step back. Okay, let's rebuild the systems, right? And I have a directory, I call it core. I call this rooted productivity, but one place where everything I do is written down. I know that's where it is, and I go back there every couple of years and rework things. Sometimes the key to the refactoring is not about the non-professional habits. A lot of times it's the professional habits. So a new type of work rhythm might start eating up a lot of schedule footprint. And now it's very difficult to do whatever, meditation practice or a sort of a fitness practice. But sometimes it's eating up a schedule footprint because it was a new type of work, and the systems you're using to organize work, the systems you're using to plan your work, is not very compatible with the new work, and so it's having an outsized footprint. So sometimes it's tuning up the professional. Okay, there's a lot of I won't go through all of them, but there's a lot of things I talk about on my podcast with like multi-scale productivity, attention-centric productivity, multi-scale planning, time block planning. There's all these different skills that are built around, okay, how do I give this attention, put this in its place, get rid of the uncertainty in how the schedule unfolds. So sometimes it's the professional habits are the things that actually need to be tuned, and the other practices are fine. There's just a different footprint to what you're doing. And then your final thing is, I think, philosophy. I think it's so critical. I mean, the best thing I'm hearing is you're intentional about how you're thinking about life. You're intentional about how you think about work fitting into other things that are important. And you're intentional about structuring parts of your life to reflect things that philosophically you think are important. That's key, right? I mean, you now have the foundation. It's when you go out into the world without that and you're just sort of bouncing from, I don't know, this professional achievement or this is impressive, that's where people end up in trouble eventually. They might end up in a place that they're not happy. So I think grounding what you're doing in philosophy is something I'm really happy to hear. It's definitely something I care a lot about.
we have run out of time, so thank you so much. I believe there's a reception afterwards, so if there's some questions, pardon?
The caterer hasn't arrived, so we're trying to track that down in the back of the room.
All right, what,
Maybe a reception afterwards. People are welcome to stay for a few minutes to chat.
okay, are there any, I might have missed some people. Okay, then if we have still some time, yeah.
Hi, and I'm so sorry. I missed the first part of the conversation, and then I haven't spent a lot of time reading your works because I've been really busy with ancient old dead guys who wrote a long time ago. But I want to ask a question about the future. Do you see any benefit to being distracted? To me, it's something uniquely human that we can do, is to be distracted and to kind of let our minds go off on another path. And I think that disruption sometimes leads to good things, that there must be something positive about distraction sometimes. And then secondly, I want to know what ends you find are most motivating for the sort of arrangement of productivity that you suggest, because I find that why be productive if not for the right ends? Why order your life accordingly if I'm not running at what is most wonderful and worthy of all my attention and dedication?
Yeah.
So,
Yeah, no, these are both good questions. We talked about them in detail in the first half of the talk. No, I'm joking. I'm joking. Yeah. So there's two really good points I want to extract from that. So one is talking about just not just distraction, but the value of doing nothing. So when digital minimalism came out, it came out the same week as Jenny Odell's book, How to Do Nothing. So Jenny and I ended up doing a lot of things in parallel for a while, and we got to talk a lot about this. And I thought it was a very perceptive book. So I think the key way to synthesize what we're talking about is to talk about what something like Jenny would talk about is the only place distraction is a problem is when you're trying to, in the moment, work on some sort of objective with your brain that's important to you, and distraction's making it harder. So distraction is a problem if, when I'm trying to write, I'm also changing my attention back and forth. Because then I can't write as well, and it's exhausting, and it's frustrating. Outside of that context, though, you're right. There's not a moral valence to distraction or doing nothing. And if anything, and this is the second point I wanted to point out, is so productivity is sort of a weird word. So I have a lot of back and forths with, and I'm friends with a lot of these people. I have a lot of back and forth. I know the sort of anti-productivity crowd pretty well, the sort of Ann Helen Peterson crowd. We have our back and forths a lot. There's a terminology issue, right? Because productivity as a term comes out of originally agriculture and then the industrial sectors, where it was often used as a metric to maximize output. So you want to maximize the ratio of output to input so that you can get as much as possible out of workers. Where typically the type of things I might talk about is more organization. So how do you take the chaos of all the stuff and organize it so it's not chaotic? And the interesting counterintuitive side effect, and I talk about this in some of the books, is when you're able to corral and organize the chaos better, you're much better able to do nothing. You're much better able to relax. You're much better able to, sort of Jenny Odell style, go to the rose garden and just look at a bird for an hour, because your mind isn't stressed out by, my God, there's so much stuff we're supposed to be doing, and I don't know, and what's due, and I'm so behind. And so the organized mind is also, the organized life is often counterintuitively the more open life. It can more counterintuitively support the life of more doing nothing. It can actually support the more minimalist life. It's, this goes back to sort of the monastic practices, right? We're organizing our lives as monks so that we can actually have more time to sort of contemplate the divine. The issue, of course, is it's easy, as with all these things, for it to spiral out of control in the other direction. So you're trying to organize the chaos so you're not stressed out, and you can actually enjoy just walking in a field. But then the issue is, what if you get so obsessed with the goal of being more organized than everyone else that you end up like a productivity YouTube, productivity prawn guy that has these 17 software things that optimize their API connections so that every minute is planned. So there's all these dangers that can pull you in that direction where you fetishize the organization itself. but I think I'm too old and tired these days to do that. So to me, I want to be organized enough that I can relax. So I think this is the interesting tension in all this is to be chaotic is stressful, to be over-organized is, can diminish life, right? To be distracted while you work can be sort of uniquely deranging, but to, avoid serendipity in all points of your life can also be impoverished as well. So I think these tensions are at the core of these issues. It's a good question.
Over there, I think. Hold on, just take a moment. Okay, just please project for our live audience.
Well, here's
there
the
we go.
mic. The mic made it to you.
Cal, thanks for your time. I'm the CEO of an engineering consulting firm. The biggest complaint we have from our employees is context switching. It's always a challenge. We've implemented things like no meeting Thursdays. We've done things to try to narrow it, but have you seen organizations that have put in place policies or things that they've done to, decrease the distraction factor?
Yeah, I mean, for sure in that context, we mentioned some of these ideas earlier, but having alternative, well-understood processes or systems through which this type of collaboration or information retrieval happens that minimizes context shifts, that's almost always what is required. So it's not enough, for example, to say, let's not do email on this day or let's not have meetings on this day. It's more to say, how are we going to organize projects so we don't need very many meetings? How are we going to work together on this so it doesn't, in general, generate so much email that we have to care about it? So I think office hours are a big thing there. Some sort of modified daily stand-up. This is like the bi-weekly docket clearing meetings where teams, you build up and then you go through a lot of issues in a synchronized manner. Those two things alone, for example, those go really far. The office hours, I learned about this from Jason Fried at Basecamp, and they did this. And they were worried about it because they thought it would bring people's ability to work to a halt if they had to wait to talk to a subject matter expert about something. And they adjusted in like a week. You just got used to the rhythms of work change. So this is when I talk to people about this. I don't do it over the tools. I would also say I'd be wary about Slack. Slack has real advantages in that it can sort of create or simulate the in-person back and forth communication style. But if it's always being used, it can be a sort of supercharged context shifter. So Slack is something that might be used with care. I know one engineering firm I talked to, they would use Slack for virtual meetings. So there'd be like certain times where people would all be on the Slack channel. So it's very easy during that set time to sort of have a transcript of what you're saying to get all the advantages of Slack. But it wasn't used outside of those times, right? So there was more strategic things. But to me, again, it always comes back to, it's less about habits or norms, it's less about setting limits, it's much more about putting in place, this is how we do this type of collaboration. Putting in place alternatives that just require fewer ad hoc meetings and require fewer unscheduled messages that arrive that have to be responded to. So it's all about the explicit alternatives.
There was a question from the live audience that seems kind of related to this. Is the Apple operating system's focus feature a step in the right direction?
Yes, I think so. I mean, yes and no. I mean, Apple did this, I think, for very strategic reasons, which is their main OS competitor, which is Android, of course, is created by and supported by Google, and it is built with the attention economy in mind, right? So Android does not want to add features that get you to look at your phone less. Apple's in the hardware business. They don't care about that. They just want you to enjoy your iPhone experience. So I think, and there's other factors here, the activist investors and ICANN, these other things going on, but I think Apple was sort of thumbing their nose at Android and saying, look, we're going to put, you're trapped in an attention economy model, you're a Google product, we're going to go the opposite way and say you can turn off your phone. We want you to actually use the phone less. You can't do that. So they thought that'd be a competitive advantage. So I think that was good. So I think culturally that's good. It shows that outside of just the business maneuver, that's a culturally attractive thing to do. The unintended consequence of that is when they added those screen time features, they disabled the ability for third-party apps to have similar fine-tuned control over app access. So there used to be way more strict apps that you could put on your iPhone to shut down, let's say, your social media usage when you didn't want to use it. And Apple said, no, no other third-party app designer is allowed to sort of restrict other apps. You have to use our service, and it's fine, but it's not nearly as intense as apps like Freedom, which was doing that much better. But I think net, I'm happy to see that because of it represents a cultural recognition that looking at this thing all the time is a problem.
Mm-hmm. There was another, all right, right in the front, and then behind.
So Cal, you referred to technology as a tool, and you told the story about IBM's servers melting down after 2 days. And I'm thinking now toward the future, 2 recently developed or released tools that are inherent or supposedly productivity tools. I'm thinking of ChatGPT and generative AI in general, and AR and VR, such as the Apple Vision Pro.
Yeah.
You know, the latter puts a screen in front of your eyes basically all the time. And so I'm wondering, to what extent do you think these will be productivity enhancing tools or just yet another way to generate more email or more distractions?
Yeah, well, it's a timely question. I spent 5 or 6 hours today. I'm up to my ears on a New Yorker piece on the productivity applications of generative AI. So if anything, I've been thinking about that one too much. So when it comes to, these are 2 different case studies. I think they're both very relevant. With generative AI, you know, the model here of productivity is the standard model, which is what I sometimes think of as cybernetic productivity. It's, I want to be connected to this tool to speed things up or get information at my fingertips faster. This has been the dominant model for the intersection of digital tools and productivity, I think, in general for the last 20 years. We want to automate simple tasks, make information more readily available, simplify or speed up communication. These have really been the main thrust of digital productivity. Those are all fine. I don't think they've had a big impact. And we know this in the numbers. You can look at, for example, total factor productivity for the last 20 years, the age of email and smartphones and ubiquitous information access to the internet. All of that stagnated. If you pull out non-agriculture, non-industrial labor productivity metrics, those also all stagnated. We don't actually, these are really miraculous innovations, right? Now, compared to 25 years ago, I can talk to anyone anywhere from a thing in my pocket. I can get basically any piece of information anywhere from a thing in my pocket. Miraculous innovations didn't actually move measurable productivity. Because I think the cybernetic productivity model, its issue is it doesn't get to the psychological reality that we've been talking about, which is what really matters with humans creating stuff with their minds is the ability to think about something without distraction, finish, move on to something else, being sequential, working on one thing after another. That's where the big wins are. Getting information to me quicker, making communication faster, was at best helping the margins, or at worst actually distracting us more because now we have to keep up with all this communication. So now I'm worse at the main thing I want to do. This is where I think generative AI is going to end up. As best I can tell right now, my best prediction is there will be various support and administrative tasks that it will speed up. It'll automate some of them, it'll make some of them a lot easier. We've been doing this for the last 20 years. Fine, right? It didn't fundamentally transform knowledge work. It didn't necessarily move the productivity metrics in really meaningful ways. I think some of the predictions that have come out recently, $7 trillion economic growth in the next decade, et cetera, you know, you could say the same thing about email. You could have said the same thing about the public internet plus search engines like Google. And that type of productivity growth didn't happen. With AR, this has been my theory for a long time that I'm still kind of out in the wilderness about this. I think it is going to become ubiquitous, whether we like it or not. There's too much money at stake to be able to essentially consolidate the entire consumer electronics business into one device. So if I now have the ability to have a phone screen, a laptop screen, a computer monitor, a television screen, anywhere I want, and it's one device that's delivering this, this means if Apple wins this war, it can take out Samsung, it can take out Sony. It's the stakes of this are so huge. This is why Apple, I think probably from a business perspective smartly, has not gone all in on AI and is going all in on AR. And I think they're being mocked for it, like, well, these developer Vision Pro goggles, they're $3,500 and it's weird with the fake videos of your eyes. Like, what are they doing here? I think they realize that's the $1 trillion play, is consolidating all consumer electronics with virtual screens, not a generative AI sort of helping you write emails or giving you a natural language interface, you know, Microsoft will add that to its Office suite, and they'll be good, and maybe that'll be that. So it's probably not going to be a good thing that we're going to have glasses and we can add virtual screens everywhere. I'm increasingly convinced that I don't see how we basically avoid that. I think there's just the economic forces. Though I will say, I'm alone in that, and I keep pitching this piece, and no one's taking it. So, don't take that too seriously, but that's what I'm thinking is going to happen.
There was any other questions?
Thanks for a great talk and very interesting responses. Two things. One is just a comment, and the other is more of a question. The comment is there was apparently a well-known traffic study in Germany about high traffic points and huge traffic jams, and there was an attempt to alleviate those by improving the highways with more lanes, and all it did was bring in more traffic.
Yep.
So analogous to the IBM study you mentioned. But the other thing I wanted to go back to was some of your initial comments on deep thinking and the life of the mind. So I don't know whether you were here when James Friedman was president. I can't remember going back or not. He mentioned the student who wanted to study Catullus or the lonely cellist, for example. But since that time, there's been a real push to do collaborative work. So, not playing the lonely cello, but being part of an ensemble, or better still, an orchestra. And there's been a real pressure to get away from individual problem solving. I certainly agree collaborative work's really important. I happen to be a chemistry professor, and when you tell students these days, sometimes you just need to go away by yourself and think about how to solve this problem on your own. That is never a popular message, and a much more popular way of working is doing collaborative work, group projects. So it seems to me that part of the deeper, in the deeper sense of the problems that you're talking about, is a devaluation of individual think as opposed to group think.
Right. I think it's a good point. I think there's two different things going on here, though. One is there's nothing about collaborative work that is contrary to the goals of concentration. In fact, in deep work, I talk about what I call the whiteboard effect, which is actually some of the deepest state of concentration are achieved when you have a small number of people looking at the same whiteboard. There's a couple things going on there. One is you're less likely to let your attention wander because now there's a sort of social cost to wait. Sorry, I didn't hear what you say. We have to go back. And two, you're able to fill in the gaps, right? So I think I give the example in the book of Shockley and his team at Bell Labs working on the transistor, and they had these offices with these blackboards. The three of them would shut the door, and there's sort of this whole story behind it. But looking at the board together actually can push you farther. So when you get stuck, someone can unstick you. As a theoretical computer scientist, for example, that's how I was trained. When I started at MIT, they had just built this fancy new Frank Gehry building for the computer science department. And I was in the theory group. And the thing they cared about most was just filling the space with giant whiteboards. Because all of the work was 3 people at a whiteboard. That's how you could push yourself harder sometimes than when you're alone. So there's nothing necessarily... when done right, collaborative deep work can be even deeper. But I think the issue going on with the students is they're uncomfortable with the concentration. So if you're working on a problem by yourself, you can't hide from that. I just have to think and I'm uncomfortable thinking. If you're in a group, you can joke and people are talking, and it just the cognitive pressure can be reduced. So it's both things can happen with the group. It can reduce the cognitive pressure or it can intensify it. So I think it's a really good point you bring up, and I think partially what's happening here is, again, because of technology, the current generation of students is probably less comfortable being alone with their own thoughts. And so that's why that's scary in a way that probably, for an engineer working at Bell Labs in the 1950s or whatever, of course, like a lot of thinking is you're just trying to solve something, and then sometimes you're stuck, and so you work with other people and they push you, and sometimes you're very comfortable with both those modes. I don't know that we're comfortable with both those modes anymore. Just being alone with your own thoughts, which seems like the most basic thing, this was sort of all of ours adolescence, was you're with your own thoughts, trying to figure out your life. It's a really big deal, and I wrote about this in one of my books, that the advent of smartphones made it possible for the first time in human history to banish from your life any time alone with your own thoughts. We've never had that be possible. It's an experiment that we're trying with the human condition. What happens if you, at the slightest hint of boredom, no matter where you are, you can get out of your own thoughts and look at a screen? And it's an unprecedented experiment, and I think it's created this discomfort with ourselves, which has a lot of downstream. I mean, that's an issue. There's a lot of other downstream. It also creates anxiety. It inhibits personal growth. It reduces resiliency. It reduces your ability to make sense of your life and to integrate your experiences and to understand how you want to move. There's so many things that come out of just, I'm bored and I'm grappling with my own thoughts. So I think since smartphones were introduced and since young adolescents got access to smartphones, for the first time in human history, we could say, what happens if you have no experience with that? And so I think we're seeing a lot of interesting negative side effects that we weren't thinking about when these things were invented.
The last question goes to the, would you still like to ask a question?
So I remember reading deep work, and one of the things I was sometimes confused was on the constraints of deep work in a way, because I know that taking 1 hour and a half to write something without any distraction is something that's going to be very positive. But if I'm taking, for example, I have 4 hours of classes in a row today, and then I want to do like 40 pages of econ reading, like, am I going further the limit? Because I remember you said we can do like 2 to 3 sessions of deep work a day, like really, really good deep work. And I wonder, like, as a college student, for example, that we really need to have a lot of those sessions, and also want to concentrate in classes. Like, how do you recommend that?
Yeah, so as college students, you have to be careful about a few things. One, when I started actually advising college students, so as a grad student, when I actually started working with real college students, this is where all my practical advice came from. And one of the practical things that emerged out of that was, especially if you have a big class schedule, so Dartmouth is quarters, so you have all these classes that are all crammed in or whatever. I call it autopilot scheduling. You got to take everything that's regular. This reading happens every week. This problem set is due every 2 weeks. And you have to figure out in advance, it's like a puzzle, when and where do I do this work every week? Like, you want to, first of all, you have to take that completely off of your day-to-day decision rhythm. This actually opens up a lot of times that you would not take advantage of if you're just saying, what do I want to work on today? Because on a typical day, you'll wait till all your classes are done. But it might actually be 9 to 10 or 8:30 to 10 plus this 1 hour between these two classes. That's actually the critical time where the econ reading should get done, and that frees up the evening. So that really matters. And the other thing that really seemed to matter was students make their schedules too hard. And so I used to go around giving talks about student stress. I think I gave it here at some point. I gave it a lot of places at that time. One of the #1 predictors of burnout and student stress was just their schedules were too hard. And there's really no reason to make I think there's a mentality that, especially at an elite school, there's a mentality that comes along of, if this is really hard, then that reflects of my capabilities and that will open up more opportunities. But the reality is no one in your future cares. Like, no one's going to look at your schedule difficulty. The tech firm is going to resume screen on your GPA and then care about, your LEET code algorithm solving problems in the interview. They don't know that your modified, econ CS major made you have to take an extra course in your sophomore summer, and it was really difficult. They don't know, or they don't care. They're not looking at, your course load. Same for activities. I used to preach, do less activities. Your job at college is to be a student, so do 1 or 2 things you care about, but also make them flexible. Don't have too much stuff on your plate. I tried to do this at Dartmouth as much as possible. I purposefully didn't double major when I might have. I wanted to take advantage of, I had some credits, AP credits. Well, let me do some independent studies to give myself some breathing room. Let me try to balance the hard courses with completely different, easier type of courses. So that's the other thing that happens is sometimes students make their schedules very hard, and then there's not much you can do. And there's not necessarily a huge benefit to it, because again, in the end, where'd you go to school, what'd you major in, what's your GPA, how are you doing the interview? That's kind of what people care about. Or if you're going to grad school, what was your GPA in the major, and can you publish? Do you know how to research? Did you publish anything? Do I have certainty that if you come here to this PhD program, you're going to be a productive member of the research team? I've been on a lot of graduate admissions committees. That's all they care about. They don't know that your schedule was hard, in your sophomore year. So that used to be the thing I would go along and preach a lot. So I'm sort of dusting off the old proverbial gospel here. But automate work so you're not making those decisions. Make your schedules easier. And then the final thing I used to tell people to do is for big things, big papers, big tests, figure out at the beginning of the term when you're going to study or write, and then put that on your calendar. So now you can start maybe 3 weeks out and start this sort of slow rhythm of scheduled blocks where you have time to start the ball moving, to start making progress, and avoid getting to the place where these 2 things are due tomorrow. and they're both going to take 10 hours, and I don't have time. So this is good. This is like memories for me. But these used to be the things I preached, and they really did work. They really did work if you did those 3 things.
Thank you so much. This has been wonderful. Great advice.